Welcome to the Resilient Campus Podcast, amplifying the voices of college inclusion innovators. I'm your host, Sabby Labor, founder and CEO of Resilient Campus. Join me each week as I interview professionals on the front lines of campus and community movement building. For more information, please visit resilientcampus.com/podcast. Today we're speaking with Maxwell Poessnecker. This is the first time that I'm interviewing anyone on the podcast in person, so I get to stare at Max's very handsome face while we talk about Max and with Max today. So let me tell you a little bit about Max. Maxwell Poessnecker currently serves as the Associate Director of Student Life and Director of LGBTQ Services at Century College. Maxwell openly identifies as a queer, first-gen, transmasculine educator. Within his work as a student affairs professional, Max strives to lift up marginalized voices and experiences, particularly those across intersections of race, gender, class, and sexuality. Max engages his work in higher education with an intentional authenticity, which continues to be a work in progress. Off campus, Max enjoys being outdoors, brewing beer, woodworking, and spending quality time with his cat, Fitzgerald. Maxwell uses he, him, and they, them pronouns. Max, thanks so much for being with us. I am super grateful that you're here, and we're here sipping coffee and water at a co-working space, so it's kind of a new atmosphere. We're not on a college campus.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, no problem. And so before Max and I got on this recording, we were just getting on the same page about, we're just here to have a conversation, and the really awkward thing about our conversation is that other people are going to listen into it later. So no worries, no pressure. Just an awkward eavesdropping of our conversation from maybe like 500 of our closest friends.
Well, this will be an experience for you all.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I know that Max put together that bio, and I have known Max for a few years now here in Minnesota, and I know that that's like super tip of the iceberg about Max. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you want people to know about you?
Well, like you mentioned, I work at Century College, which is a 2-year community and technical college in White Bear Lake that's just northeast of the Twin Cities. And I've been there for just over a year now, I think, like coming up on a year and a half, actually, which is quite remarkable when you think about it. And so I've been there, and before that I also worked at another community college, St. Paul College. So to, I guess, maybe step back a little bit is I'm not a Minnesotan native. And I very much dress the part, but I actually come from Nebraska. And I think a lot of what I talk about today will really resonate when folks know the fact that I come from a very small, rural, conservative community. I grew up in Nebraska in a town of 150 people. I graduated 24 kids, and that was the largest class at the time in our school.
Wow.
Yeah. So I went to Wayne State College, which is a small 4-year state school after that, and then moved to Minnesota for graduate school. And so when I was in my search for schools, I really didn't necessarily know what my end goal was going to be, but I wound up in Mankato, and after I graduated from Mankato, I moved up to the Twin Cities. And I spent about a year outside of higher education searching for a career. And now I'm in the community and technical end of higher education. Yeah,
and I just saw Max last week. We were at our state professional association conference, and you were talking with folks through this lens of inclusion, equity, power, privilege, oppression. You were looking at it through that lens to talk about kind of the role that 2-year colleges play, and I was so grateful. I'm always just super nerding out on community colleges in general, and so I appreciated that there was a full panel on it. And of course I was late, and everybody's looking at me as I'm walking in, but I had to sit in the front row because I just had
but everybody already
everything.
knows you anyway, so it wasn't quite that awkward.
I think that makes it more awkward. Yeah. When you're super butchish walking in in dapper wear, and everybody's in Minnesota, they won't look at you directly, but they're judging.
I mean, I was looking only because I was damn, you got better shoes than I do today. And also because I was double checking to make sure we weren't wearing the same pants.
Yeah, that happens to us, folks. And just to let folks know, like if you're outside of the Midwest, our attire, like our uniform here, does consist of things outside of flannel. Just to let you know.
But not much. I mean, because, like 80% of our weather is like snowy season. So I will say that I have a very specific section in my closet just for flannel.
That's good to know. So, Max, tell us about the identities that are most salient for you today. I know that they're probably different across time, but when you're out in the world in your dapper wear, what's like at the top of your mind in terms of how people are reading you, or what are those identities that are most prominent for you right now?
So I think it definitely depends upon like the space that I'm occupying at that given moment. But for me, I think a lot about my queerness, a lot about my transness and my whiteness, particularly in spaces of higher education. And these identities, particularly like my transness, is very new to me. Because I didn't really have the language or the identity to like hold on to until like within the last couple of years. In fact, I didn't come out as trans until grad school. And a lot of that was by growing up in a small rural place. Like I didn't have the language, and I didn't have folks that I could see myself reflected in. Mm-hmm. And so I think that I'm in a place right now of really better understanding my identity and where I fit into the work that I feel called to do. And so while I think a lot about that, I also think about, how I've shifted through, I guess, like class. And I grew up in a working, low-income background. And I guess I don't really know like where to put myself on the map, but I guess if I had to, I would say I'm probably closer to middle class than I would be working class from my background. But I also identify as a first generation student. I identify as a partner. I also think a lot about age. And so I think that this really couples with my trans identity, and I know we've talked about this before. But when I was in the early stages of thinking whether or not like I wanted to medically transition, I was thinking about the ways in which I interacted with folks to feel that I belong in those spaces. So, for example, I appear very young, which like I completely am thankful for, because I will appreciate that down the road. But what I was finding is before I transitioned, a lot of folks would think that I was much younger than I was. And I was not feeling that what I was bringing to the table seemed very credible. And so I knew that when transitioning was something that was right for me, I wanted to see my body reflect certain aspects and characteristics. Like, I was really excited about getting facial hair, and I was really excited about, my voice lowering. But I also was frustrated with the notion that if I were to gain these characteristics, that's what society would want my transness to look like, right? And so I wanted to resist the notions of like cisness and like what masculinity looks like, but at the same time also feel like I belong and like I have a space at the table. And so kind of the intersections around like age and transness are something that I think a lot about. And I'm a crafts person. My partner gives me a hard time that I pick up a lot of projects and I never finish any of them because I just constantly want to learn and grow in my ability to work with my hands. So like I love brewing beer, and I love woodworking and leathersmithing and like making soap and just like all things very stereotypical Minnesotan. But something I also picked up recently is CrossFit. So I joined a super awesome, super like trans, queer-minded CrossFit gym, and that's really like reframed the ways that I think about my body. And I also just really enjoy being an outdoors enthusiast. So those are a lot of the things I find make me whole and make me the Max that navigates this world.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing all that. I think that one of the things I know about you is that I know that those are your hobbies or that you do, crafts, and that you're really good at them. Like when you do something, so Max showed me this pretty sizable PVC pipe evaluation tool that you set up for your workshops. And I was like, oh my God, that's so cool. Just this like 3-dimensional PVC pipe thing that you put together. And I'm like, oh my God, you're so handy.
Yeah. It's like a Likert scale type of setup. Yeah. So, and so far students have been really receptive to it, but I guess that's one of the perks of also working in student life.
You could describe it better than I can, but how would you describe it to people listening in case they wanted to build something similar to this? I
mean, all I did was I just made this like freestanding structure with PVC pipe. And so I just made, like if you think about like getting cell phone service, that kind of a setup. So like the highest pipe to like the lowest pipe. And so it's like strongly agree down to strongly disagree. And then folks can drop in like a chip that corresponds with their answer to whatever question that you pose. Yeah. And so I just set it up so we have like a marker board that we attach to it and just ask a different question based off of the different program. And so that's a really good way to get some really easy, like low-hanging fruit type of like data collection.
Yeah, I love it. And it's like super kinesthetic, so if people are tired of filling out surveys.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's obviously very green, so I try to like find ways to cut down on our paper use as well.
Yeah. So Max, tell us about the inclusion work that you're doing today at Century College.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of my inclusion work is very surface level right now because there's a lot to be done on our campus. But just some of the things that I think I'm really excited about and what I'm doing is I am trying to construct language around a possible pronoun policy. I'm finding that a lot of our students are feeling invalidated in the classrooms and on campus because we don't have a way to hold folks accountable for making sure that our students aren't being misgendered. And so I'm hoping that this starts a conversation at the system office level, which would be really exciting.
Yeah.
So beyond that, I'm taking on some pretty big ticket items. I guess I could have started by saying like my focus this year in my work is really structured around policy and procedure work. Whereas my first year I was trying to do a lot of programming. And so I've now shifted that. And so I'm working around pronoun policies. I'm also working around, creating and renovating more gender inclusive restrooms on our campus. I am putting together and facilitating brave space trainings. Others might call it, safe zone, safe space, ally trainings, but I've been intentional, and I don't know that brave space is where I ultimately want to land, but I know it feels better than safe zone or ally because we can't guarantee safety for our students, right? Like we can to a certain extent, but after they leave our offices and our classrooms, like we don't know what's going to happen to them. So I really want to make sure that we are educating ourselves to learn how to be a safer campus, but we can't guarantee safety. And I also don't love the identity of being an ally because I think that there's so much empty symbolism that is paired with being an ally, so I see a lot of administrators and faculty and staff coming to these types of trainings, and to them it's that checkbox. They're coming because they like me and they want to learn, and I think that they're coming with good intentions, but I think too is they want that rainbow sticker, they want that packet of resources and then just leave. And so one thing that I do talk about and we work through in these trainings is about the notion of allyship and empty symbolism. And so one quote that I use is from Mia Mackenzie in Black Girl Dangerous that talks about allyship. And Mia writes, allyship is not supposed to be about you, your feelings, of glorifying yourself at the expense of the folks you claim to be an ally to. It's not supposed to be a performance. It's supposed to be a way of living your life that doesn't reinforce the same oppressive behaviors you're claiming to be against. Actions count, labels don't. The work of an ally is never ceasing. Allyship is not an identity, it's a practice. Sounds exhausting? Because the people who experience racism, misogyny, ableism, queerphobia, transphobia, classism are exhausted. So why shouldn't their allies be?
Beautiful.
Yeah. So I think it definitely provides some like call out context. But I think it's needed call out context too. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of, it's contextualizing. You think you're exhausted? Live this every day.
Yeah.
Right? It's like you're like literally adjusting to the idea, whether gradually or rapidly, that racism exists, that transphobia exists, and this is what it looks like, and this is what you can do about it.
Yeah.
And I think that people get overwhelmed at that point, and there's a very transactional idea about how we check the boxes off, like you were saying.
Yeah.
And I love the quote that Mia Mackenzie has, because it's like, I mean, you think you can imagine what it's like, and then here, walk in these shoes, or walk in those shoes, or roll in this wheelchair, like to know, right? To know what it's truly like.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think, then where do we go from there? Because we can ask these folks to like live this experience, but I feel like, the ways in which folks oftentimes think about doing that is in a very tokenizing way. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's where I'm at, is like, how do we get folks to this place of like understanding and experiencing like the ways in which like they perpetuate like racism and transphobia, but in a way that isn't like tokenizing to our own identities. One of my mentors I talked about is Dr. Penny Rosenthal. Is something that she always said was, use your powers for good. And I think that, it really goes along with that notion of like, how do you use your privileges that you can access certain spaces and do it in a way that isn't this kind of gross notion of like the white savior. The white savior. Yeah. Thanks. But also is making sure that those identities are very much at the front, of the movement with intentional efforts. And one of the pieces to working on a community and technical college is you do a little of everything. Mm-hmm. And that can be both a benefit, but it also can be really challenging. Mm-hmm. Right now, where I'm at right in my work, the challenging part is more salient than anything else.
Sure.
Within my role, for folks to have some context, I oversee multiple different areas. I am the director of our LGBTQ Center, which is actually only 20% of my role. So I'm doing a director level position at only 20% of my work. I'm also a student conduct officer. I'm a Title IX investigator. I also oversee an experiential education program, which is called Ducks Leadership. And then I also am on our orientation team, among all the other committees and whatnot that I'm doing. So for folks who work at community colleges, like, you understand the concept really easily of like wearing 17 hats at all times, mm-hmm. right? Some of the things that I find that I'm doing within my work at Century is really just trying to constantly put out fires. The role when I came into it was very new, so there's so much room for growth and opportunity to like expand on current programs and then to create new initiatives. But I feel because of the fact that community colleges are oftentimes like underfunded and under-resourced, like you're constantly feeling like you're just trying to like keep your head above water. And that is really difficult for me because I really came into this position as a new professional, very eager and excited. And I still have that motivation, but I'm finding that it's difficult to really dive deep into one particular initiative and really just completely 180 it.
I think that I've heard this quite often, is that when we are new professionals and we're entering with this, I don't want to say utopic, but we do want to do a lot of good in these mm-hmm. roles. And we maybe have one idea or one vision about all the possible things that we can accomplish as a new professional. So for people that might be moving from grad school into their first professional role, or maybe this is their new professional era, like, do you have any guidance for them on how to manage maybe wearing 17 hats, or just kind of entering this leg of their journey, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, like, ready for the world? What would you tell your new professional self looking back on it now?
For me, It's really like knowing my limits and my boundaries and setting very clear goals and expectations for myself. So I find that like having visual representations of those goals around you at all times is what helps keep myself accountable. So if I weren't writing down like the goals that I wanted to accomplish or things that I felt were realistic to even like start to work on, then I wouldn't have any capacity for myself. You know, I think a lot about this, and a lot of the other folks that you've interviewed have talked about this, is something that I balance is like respectability politics and also the notion of like the imposter syndrome. And so I come at this work in a place where I want my work to be very close to perfect. And of course, like I know that's not a reality, but I feel that, you know, we've been socialized to do our work in a way that's just so. And then when I don't reach my expectations or my goals, then I feel that I've fallen short of, you know, being perfect or being able to complete that project the way that I wanted it to be. And then I question myself, like, is this the work that I'm supposed to be doing? Like, do I feel like I have the experience, and do I feel like my identities are relevant in this work? And so I tend to like question not only my work, but myself and my identities. And so I think that that's been something that I've been really trying to work on lately, is just like knowing that your experiences, your identity are valid, and like you're supposed to be in this place at this time. And so setting like very clear expectations and giving yourself a break. Like not feeling that you have to do it all this year. Yeah. Like you have tons of time to do lots of great work.
Was there any particular mentors or possibility models that you were able to see on your campuses?
You know, for my work right now, I really struggle because I am the queer and trans person on campus, right? Like I am the expected professional, the expected expert in my role. And so there's like this push from the top to get this and that done. And I feel that I don't necessarily have any other folks that I can go to on my campus that have similar lived experiences that I can like just vent to them of like, I want to do this work because it's something I'm passionate about, but I'm exhausted and I feel incredibly tokenized in this work.
Yeah. I think beyond you being the only one on your campus, I think what Max and I have talked about on a couple of occasions is that you might be one of 3 now LGBT centers that are on a 2-year college campus, and Minnesota was the first one, right?
Yeah, I don't know the history, but Century College is, to my knowledge, at this point in time, well, I know for sure we're the first LGBTQ center on a 2-year campus in Minnesota, and we might still be the only.
In Minnesota.
Yeah. Yep.
And so, you know, it's like I kind of picture these kind of layers of being able to check in with peers across like our functional areas or across departments or within departments, but then we look at these different layers of trying to create a blueprint when there is no blueprint for having an LGBT center, doing a director role as a 20%, right? When you know that that could be 120% and still it would be, you know, need to be another person or multiple people doing that work. So it's like not undervaluing or underestimating the simple fact that, you know, you're running a really innovative program, and often that means like you're the only one.
And I feel like in that work too, you know, like I mentioned earlier, is I'm coming into this role and, you know, there's been great work that's been done, but it's very foundational. You know, like the center was there, and there was a few trainings put in place, and there's a couple gender inclusive restrooms. And so I think, you know, where my passion lies is really taking some of that foundation and like recreating very new, very radical like initiatives from that. But I feel like I want to be there, but I can't because there's so much that hasn't even been started or has been done yet. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to do them both together. I'm trying to start it and make it this phenomenal, awesome program all together at the same time, which is incredibly exhausting. Whereas like I need to just put together like a Brave Space training, you know, and like just get it together, get it out the door, you know, get folks into these trainings and these programs. And then once you've done that, then try to look at like, how do you build more trainings? How do you build, you know, better trainings? How do you get other people to your trainings? How do you get other people to do the training? So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a lot. It's a lot. You're both building the foundation and building on top of the foundation as you build it simultaneously.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you for sharing all of that. What brought you to this point? Like, how did you intentionally start doing student life and queer and trans work to your campus? Was that always part of the plan?
No.
How has it emerged for you? Like, what brought you here?
Yeah. When I went into college, I actually started in pre-medicine.
Interesting.
I was going to be a pediatrician. Yeah. Lasted a semester. Got the heck out of that. And I switched to communication studies and theater, which was very, very across the spectrum. And as I was in college, you know, I was the type of student that was involved in like pretty much everything. I played rugby, I was in theater, I was like an orientation leader, like I was in just tons of clubs and organizations. And so I remember being really inspired by my advisors and thinking like, man, this is the work that I want to do someday. And so I would ask them, how did you get to this work? And they'd be like, I got a master's degree in women's studies. I got a master's degree in counseling or communication studies. And so that's what made most sense to me as well. Since I already have this background in comm, I'm going to continue doing that work. And so I landed in Mankato, and I was in the communication studies department. I was also getting a women and gender studies certificate. And so my plan was go through this program, hope to get a job like, you know, in whatever might come about, or I might even just like go on and teach someday. And so I was in my first semester in grad school, and I was talking to my advisor about, you know, what my end goal was. And she's like, I think that you need to go talk to Dr. Penny Rosenthal in the counseling and student personnel department. And so I set up an appointment with her, and like a 1-hour meeting turned into a 4-hour meeting. And this is like right the day before fall holiday. And, of course, like I had to drive home to Nebraska that night to spend the holiday with my family. And I didn't leave, you know, campus until like 6 o'clock, and I had like a 7-hour drive in front of me. But I just remember like that moment, like that conversation, like completely like shifted the way in which I felt I was needed in this world. And so I turned 2 years into 3 years of grad school. During my time, I worked in our student life office. I also worked in an LGBTQ Center. And so those are the functional areas that I felt most confident and passionate about. And so when I was doing my job search, I knew that I wanted to be in the Twin Cities because my partner was here. And so being regionally bound, I really had to open up the doors to possibilities. And so I was looking into residence life and academic advising, admissions, and those are all like areas that I'm very much interested in, but I knew that the work that I felt called to do wasn't necessarily directly going to happen in those spaces. And so I went about a year before I got a gig in higher ed, and then I worked on a grant for 6 months until the current role came about.
Yeah. And you were doing advising in that previous role.
Yeah, I was a career navigator. I was working in a grant that was basically working with marginalized communities to get them fast-tracked into a trade program.
Amazing. And so what I know about you, Max, is that you're teaching college classes right now. So one of the things that you just said and kind of talking about how you arrived to this work is that maybe one day you'd teach women and gender studies, or maybe one day that you'd teach, period. And so tell us about teaching, and what would people need to know about, like, if they're considering, because I think often, and this is my anecdotal experience, is that, and my spouse, she totally laughs at me about this today because she said, I told you so, is that I would always say, well, when you get into student affairs, it makes it really, really challenging to get into teaching roles unless they're like a first year experience or a transfer class or like a peer counseling class. And I told her, like, I would never be able to get into teaching. She says, never say never. So today, you know, now she laughs at me because she's like, I told you so. What else do you want me to dismantle, you know, these beliefs that you're throwing out there? And so tell us, like, what do you want people to know about teaching at the college level, as someone with a student affairs and higher ed background, like, for people that might be considering it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have to say, though, like, for listeners, it's like I'm teaching because of Savvy.
Oh my God.
Because here's how it happened. You know, like, Savvy was like texting me one day and was like, hey, do you have any interest in teaching? And I was like, yeah, maybe. And then they were like, hey, how about you teach this class this fall? And this was probably like 4 or 5 weeks before the class started. And I was like, okay, here we go. Let's do it. And so I mentioned that because I do talk about this a lot, is there isn't really necessarily room or many opportunities for student affair practitioners to get to teach. And a lot of that is the way that our system is structured. You have to have so many credits within a certain degree in order to be able to teach in that functional area or that, like, area of interest. And so I was able to bypass that because like, I got my foot in the door by Savvy recommending me. And so I highly recommend the opportunity for teaching. And I say this in a couple different ways. My snarky self says do it because there are very clear silos in higher education where oftentimes, I know I felt this, is I feel very much like a second-class citizen to faculty. And I think that there is a lot of credentialism that happens in colleges on any campus, and I know it happens a lot on two-year campuses as well. And so I say that in a way of, like, being able to have that on your resume, to have both sides of the story. But I also think that it's a really awesome opportunity to engage with students in an incredibly rewarding way. To see students come into your classroom and then to watch them leave your classroom with their mind blown is super rewarding.
Faculty used to say, well, you know, you're just someone that has contact with the students outside of class, maybe once or twice a semester. And that was their assumption. And they're saying, you know, their thought was, well, we have them every week or twice a week. So we get to see them, you know, return, and we get to build upon that knowledge. And really, my snarky self, the reason I say it's snarky is because now I see what they were saying. I do think it's an oversimplification to say that we as student affairs professionals don't have a return. You know, we don't have an ongoing relationship. We don't have that kind of rapport. We don't have leadership programs and other co-curriculars. We have these high impact practices set up for a reason, and these, like, co-curricular student engagement models built in such a way that I think faculty often don't understand that we do have ongoing relationships. And I think what you become more aware of, like, when you're in the classroom for a while and then you're outside of the classroom supporting the leadership and other, like, holistic growth, is that neither one of these silos, as they are structured today, neither one of them does the job of student success by themselves.
Yeah.
And, like, we're joking if we think that we are. We're doing it together, and when we're not, the students suffer.
Yeah.
And I really didn't have the language to, you know, when faculty would tell me that, I'd just be like, wow, maybe you're right.
Yeah.
Maybe, you know. And in my higher ed program, which was student affairs focused, I remember being one of a few people who was like, I'm really convinced that I'm going to be the one to bridge academic and student affairs. And people would ask me how, and I would say, I don't know yet, but, you know, I'll keep you posted. And I remember, you know, Dr. Vincent Vigil, who is one of my mentors, and gave me the first opportunity to teach. Yeah. And, you know, he's a queer person of color, super amazing, like, always lifting other people up as he moves along his pathway. But he was like, hey, do you want to co-teach a peer counseling class? And I was like, what's peer counseling? You know, like, what exactly are you asking me to teach? Yeah. And my imposter syndrome right? That kicks in when you're like, I'm not worthy to teach.
Yep, absolutely.
What we learn about teaching in the college environment is that I'm not credentialed. I don't have a terminal degree in peer counseling, right? And so I remember Vincent, was really sweet with me and was just really kind and was like, well, let me tell you a little bit more about it before you start freaking out, honestly. And this is one of the ways that I think that we're able to see inside the classroom. Like someone has to give us the opportunity to teach, whether it's like, Max, come in and presents, on this topic for this week and, be a part of the experience or a whole class or co-teaching together.
Well, and I think something that I've been able to experience is, so like my master's program was counseling centered. And so while I obviously don't want to say I'm a counselor, like I've had experience being in environments that emulate counseling practices. And so I really appreciate like having the ability to really be vulnerable with students. And I don't see that a lot in the classroom. And so I think that the way that I've been able to approach my work in the classroom is just being really real with my students by telling them, like, I am your instructor. However, like, I don't want this to seem like some sort of weird power dynamic. Like, I'm here to facilitate conversation that you experience on a daily basis. And like being able to share my identities and my experiences is really rewarding to them and allows them to see you like as a person too. Because we know that like higher education in the classroom has been set up for certain student identities to persist and succeed. And I think this is one of the ways that I try to approach that work and break down these barriers.
So tell me about, because I know one of the things about you as a white identified person is that you really are adding to your toolkit and your competencies and your self-awareness regularly in an ongoing, very intentional basis as a white ally. For someone who's teaching gender studies and you're centering like intersectionality and power, privilege, and oppression and this understanding that racism exists and it's like this primary lens in which we understand gender and these other constructs. Like for someone listening in that's like, hey, I am a white ally, what can I do about it? What are some of those tactics or those strategies that I can do to like show up for people of color? Yeah. Do you have any suggestions for them?
I don't have all the answers. I mean, for me is because like this is a constant work in progress. I think the big thing for me is, and maybe this can also be a downfall, is like I'm constantly trying to think of the ways in which I take up space. And I think about this, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately because of the ways that my identities have shifted. And I think, for 20 some years of my life, I was perceived and socialized to be a female identified person. And now I'm coming to spaces as somebody who is seen to have like the most privilege in our society, is like a white cis male to the outside person. And so I am very like sometimes overly cognizant of those identities. And so I really try to make sure that I'm putting my energy and my efforts into the work intentionally and uplifting voices of color and knowing like when to step in and step back. This isn't new work for me, but it definitely is work, and I have a long way to go in it. And so there's this group that I'm a part of. It's a collective, and we're a group of like white queer identified folk talking about our lived experiences and how through our experiences we can end white supremacy, right? One of the resources or like kind of the framework that we have structured our collective around is the text Emergent Strategy. And that book is by Adrienne Maree Brown. And Adrienne talks about just that, is like the notion of collectivity, right? And so what I think is really beautiful about this work is thinking about the ways in which we can work together in collective that doesn't necessarily need to be overly academic.
I'm like kind of obsessed with emergent strategy.
Sure. So I want folks to know too is like I haven't gotten super deep into it, so like I'm very, very new into my reading, but there are some really key takeaways. So this book is actually inspired by Octavia Butler, and so in the text, Adrienne writes a little synopsis of Octavia Butler, and Octavia says, "All successful life is adaptable, opportunistic, tenacious, interconnected, and fecund. Understand this, use it, shape God," right? And so then Adrienne goes on to talk about like what emergent strategy is, or specifically what emergence is. So I'll read a little excerpt from the book. So Adrienne writes, "Emergence is the way complex systems and patterns arise out of the multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. There are examples of emergence everywhere." And I think this is where like my outdoorsy like personality really gets like nerdy into this book. "So birds don't make a plan to migrate, raising resources to fund their way, packing for scarce times, mapping out their pit stops. They feel a call in their bodies that they must go, and they must follow it, responding to each other, each bringing their adaptations. There is an art to flocking, staying separate enough not to crowd each other, aligned enough to maintain a shared direction, and cohesive enough to always move toward each other, responding to destiny together. Destiny is a calling and creates a beautiful journey. Emergence is beyond what the sum of its parts could even imagine. A group of caterpillars and nymphs might not see flight in their future, but it's inevitable. It's destiny. Oak trees don't set an intention to listen to each other better, or agree to hold tight to each other when the next storm comes. Under the earth, always, they reach for each other, they grow such that their roots are intertwined and create a system of strength that is resilient on a sunny day as it is in a hurricane. Dandelions don't know whether they are a weed or a brilliance, but each seed can create a field of dandelions. We are invited to be that prolific and to return fertility to the soil around us."
Love it.
Yeah. So I think it's super awesome in the ways in which, like, she really connects, like, people to nature, right?
Yeah.
And, like, thinking, like, because so oftentimes I think that we come to this work thinking so big scale and so academic. And I think that a lot of times the answers are right in front of us in, like, what surrounds us in nature.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like, well, what fits the context right now? Like, what makes sense given the students that you have, given the context of the nation and the world?
Yep.
What do we need to be focusing in on? And that priority changes based on all of that information. And people get so deeply uncomfortable with that. Mm-hmm. They're like, well, but how are you going to bring other people along in that? Because what I love that Adrienne Maree Brown says is be certain that the people in the room, there is a conversation to be had between those people. And it's like this idea that we can walk in with an agenda.
Yep.
You know, this idea of leadership as one to many. And that's not working. So
yeah. So for the folks out there that are listening, if you kind of want like the quick like synopsis of like the principles of Adrienne's work, this is what you need to know. So Adrienne says, small is good, small is all. The large is a reflection of the small. Change is constant, be like water. There is always enough time for the right work. There is a conversation in the room that only these people at this moment can have. Find it. Never a failure, always a lesson. Trust the people. If you trust the people, they become trustworthy. Move at the speed of trust. Focus on critical connections more than critical mass. Build the resilience by building the relationships. Less prep, more presence, and what you pay attention to grows.
I love it. Because of my obsession with this book and because you're bringing it into this conversation, I really do think that people have to read this book.
Oh, absolutely. Being in this work, it's friggin' exhausting because so oftentimes, like, you are the only person that students see themselves in. And even if you don't have identities that they also share, oftentimes you might be like one of the few marginalized people that they feel that they can come to. And so like you're constantly working with students, whether you're on the clock or not, like you constantly take your work home. And so I think that because like there's that exhaustion, and I know for me is like because I also identify as an activist and I want to do work in my community outside of campus, I feel that by the time I get to that point, I'm just like, I'm super exhausted, I'm burnt out, I don't feel like I can contribute to this, but then I shame myself because I'm like, what am I doing? I want to be a part of this movement, but yet I don't feel like I can be because I've given all my energy and my work to my students. And so I think that like this book really talks a lot about the power of like people and the power of just like relying on one another.
Nice.
Yeah.
And so for people listening in, just listen to the end of this podcast and I'll give instructions, a little secret code language for you to be able to enter to win a copy of Adrienne Maree Brown's book called Emergent Strategy, because it is so important. It's one of the critical reads of our movement today. If we're going to build this collective, I think we all need to know what she's putting out there in the world because it's so important. Yeah. Let's switch gears a little bit, although I think it's completely related, regarding some of the most prominent or the biggest lessons that stand out to you. Are there one or two that you can identify that have been the biggest lessons of your professional life so far?
Yeah, this is something that was always said to me in grad school, is like trust the process, right? And it's so hard to do that sometimes because I'm very much a person, I want to know what's happening, where it's happening, and where it's going. Like, what does my future look like? Not only do I want to know what I'm doing tonight for dinner, I want to know what I'm doing 5 years from now. And that's unreasonable. So I think that sometimes like we don't always know, where is our work going, and that's okay. So I think like trusting the process of like where you're at and knowing that like you know what you know at that moment best. And so trust yourself in that you're putting all of your effort into that work at that moment, at any given moment in time. I think something else too, and I've touched on this a little bit, is like you can't do it all. And this comes from a place of being a new professional and being, like the person on my campus to do all the work, all the queer work. And so while you can't do it all, like stop shaming yourself when you feel that you're coming in short, or like however you're defining that for yourself. And so, this is something that I've talked about, like with my struggle between like respectability politics and the imposter syndrome. I tend to want to constantly like feel that I am proving my identities and I'm proving my worth and that like I deserve to have a place at the table. And so, I know that I deserve to have a place at the table. And so like stop feeling like you need to constantly like prove that, because no matter who you are, what identities you hold, like you deserve to have a place at the table.
Amazing. For other professionals, can you think of a piece of guidance that you'd like to share with other people doing inclusion and equity work in general?
I think in working for liberation and like true liberation, there is room for a variety of ways to show up in that movement, right? And so I think that like don't ever discount your ability to be a part of any movement. And most importantly is like as marginalized folks, we need to make sure that our identities are at the core of that movement too.
Yeah.
Because so oftentimes it's really easy to put our own identities on a shelf and strive to be a part of a movement that should include our identities.
Yeah. It's amazing. So I know we've talked about the one resource that you would share with other people, but what I ask from each person is, if there's a resource, whether it's a blog or a book or a podcast or something that really informs the way that you approach your work, that other people should read, should look into, should listen to, what is that resource that you would share with them?
I think we can both say, like, everybody read Emergent Strategy.
Yes, today.
And don't put it down until you finish it.
Yep. We're watching you. We'll know if you, don't put that down. You don't need to sleep. No, you do need to sleep.
Yeah, no. And sometimes that's like my struggle is like, don't read a book in bed because you will fall asleep. That's what I found out for sure. I don't know how many times I've woken up with a book on my face.
Yeah. Those grad students out there, don't be reading your textbook.
Because they're a lot heavier too. I think another book, and both of these are books that I'm just like dipping my toe in, is Black Girl Dangerous. Not only read the book, but also like follow the website, because there's all sorts of like super awesome articles on there that Mia Mackenzie has like put out into the world, and a lot of other super awesome like queer and trans people and QTPOC folks that are contributing to this website. So definitely follow along with that. But you know, like we were talking earlier, is I really haven't found my flow yet. Since being out of grad school, I'm kind of still in that phase where I'm like, ugh, reading. You know? And also like I feel sometimes like by the time I get to a point of reading, while I know that like reading books like these are very like insightful and invigorating and like motivating for me, I just need to shut off my brain. And so I haven't gotten quite to a place where I know how to balance that yet. Mm-hmm. So I've been reading books very slowly. And I think my partner would say the same about like my reading style, along with like my hobby style, is I'm really great at picking up books and then like putting them down after like the first 3 chapters, and then not coming back to them for a really long time and just having to completely start all the way over from the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how long have you been out of grad school now?
May of 2015. So yeah, just like 2.5 years now.
Yeah. So it's like a slow curve of like even returning to wanting to read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Because when you're forced to read so much for so long, and like granted, like I haven't been one that like used to read a lot as a kid. It was forced. It's hard to like be forced to read and then like want to go back into like doing it for leisure.
Right. Yeah. It's so interesting. I'm like on that similar post-graduate school, you know, there's like a pile of books stacked up just waiting for me to read them. And I don't know if you read multiple books at the same time, but I have a little bit of a similar, like I can't read a full book beginning to end. I mean, there's very few that I've done that with. But I typically read multiple books at the same time. And I don't say that because I'm some like, you know, prodigy genius. I say that because like my attention span, I have to read, like right now I'm reading Kaukalia Yang's Late Homecomer, but I've been reading it for like 6 months.
Yep.
And I'll pick up a few pages.
Yep.
And then I read Octavia Butler's Kindred. And I read that one front to back. It was just, I couldn't not know what was going to happen next. It was too suspenseful.
Yeah.
But you know, and then I'm reading like some business and self-help books, which are totally opposite of...
Yeah, and I get to where, I totally agree. Maybe I feel like listeners out there are like, Max hates reading, like, reading is everything. But I think maybe, like, I'm recognizing that I just, like, my attention span is very short. So, like, I flip back and forth between books, and then I'm like, oh, I need to buy this on Amazon. And so I really am good about being like, oh, I'm going to add all these books to my collection. And then just never getting around to actually reading them front to back.
Yeah. I mean, one day I think I've been building that collection for quite a while now. I have hope. I am returning to many of them, but they've been collecting dust for a long time.
Yeah. I'm just building up my library.
Yeah.
Just to make it look good. And eventually I'll get around to claiming that it's like a true functioning library.
Where lenders pull out books and check them out from your personal collection.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to like check out any books, like I probably have tons that you can check out that don't have any notes or highlighting. Yeah. Like they still have the new book smell.
Yeah, nice. So as we kind of wrap up our time together, are there any concluding thoughts, anything we haven't covered that you want folks to know that are listening in?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think I've kind of been a little all over the place today. And since we've been chatting, I've been reflecting a little more on like your question of, you know, what's one piece of advice for like professionals doing equity work. And granted, I've been talking about this a lot, but I was reading an article today from Black Girl Dangerous on their website about like how collectivity, just like how powerful collectivity is, and that, you know, like you're not alone in this work and you shouldn't be doing this work alone. Because as, you know, like marginalized folks, we are considered an emergency responder. And, you know, I think about that a lot. That's been affecting me a lot lately in my role is, you know, like I'm carrying on emotional burdens for my students, for myself, and then, you know, doing conduct in Title IX work too. And so for some reason, like this semester has been really hectic. We've had a number of, you know, like different attacks on campus. We've unfortunately lost a couple students. And so it's just been like very emotionally exhausting. And so I find that it's increasingly difficult, obviously, to work in that environment, along with like the continued violence that's happening in our communities with like queer and trans folk of color. And like the scale of it just becomes seemingly more overwhelming all the time. And as a marginalized person, like living with these identities that are constantly being silenced and are being like attacked and killed, oftentimes like my immediate response to that is to like mass devastation is like numbness. But at the same time, I feel that there's these notions of responsibility that kick in. And I feel it like an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Like if I don't take care of my students, of my queer and trans students, like who will? Because like I've been hired to take care of them. And I think that's also an issue that I have is like trying to like emphasize like this is everyone's work. Like y'all, like I can't do this by myself on campus. And while these are obviously like psychological protective defenses to avoid pain, I know that the only way to truly deal with pain is to let it in and witness its truth, right? And so, like as marginalized folks, like we've been taking care of ourselves for decades. Like we have been working through tragedy and loss, before we even knew like what therapy was. And so I think it's increasingly important. I think I want to emphasize that might be maybe the theme of my talk today is community and being with one another during times of pain and struggle. So really going back to y'all need to friggin' read Emergent Strategy.
Yeah. I love what you're bringing to this conversation around being in community, because we're headed into the winter here. And for a lot of our people who are doing this work, it's like it is compounded by the fact that we have less sunlight, less warmth in general. And then it's easy to just kind of climb into your little cave once you get done with the day and it's already dark outside, you know, because it was the sunset at 4:30 or whatever. Yeah. And we go home and you're exhausted. So then you just want to go to sleep. And then we don't see each other for like 6 to 8 months. And, you know, so it's like really important to be in community and to host gatherings or like invite people over for meals and stuff like that, right? So that we can like be in community.
It doesn't need to involve any sort of like agenda.
Okay, cool. So Max, you're a super cool person, great professional. I'm super excited for what, you know, and I try to tell you this as regularly as possible, but what you've already accomplished and what you're going to accomplish, whether it's in this field, because this is where you want to be, or whatever you do. I think that you're going to do super cool things in this lifetime of ours. And I would love for people to add you to their network. So what's that most preferred way for you, for people to connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a lot of the staples, you know, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, LinkedIn. I think for me, I tend to probably be most active on Instagram. I do have a Twitter, I will say that, but I'm not a big Twitter user. Maybe I should probably do that because, I mean, it's helpful.
Okay.
Yeah. You could probably see like stuff that I tweeted like when I attended ACPA like 3 years ago. That's probably the last time I ever tweeted. But no, yeah, like check me out on Instagram, add me to LinkedIn. Of course, like feel free to always like email me. I'm sure that you'll link my email as well. So I'm willing to be a resource any way I possibly can be.
Awesome. So what I'll do is I will put it on the show notes for people listening in, so you can actually go to resilientcampus.com/11. So the shorthand that I keep forgetting on every single episode to mention is that each episode has its own individual page with show notes, and it has the resources. So I'll be including the Black Girl Dangerous blog and some of the other, a link to some of the other resources that were mentioned by Max, as well as how you can connect with Max. So we've come to that time where we're going to close out, and we're going to do it a little bit differently today. So Max is actually going to read the inspirational quote, and we're going to close out with that quote to send you back out into the world. And so Max is going to read who that quote came from and what the quote is.
The quote today comes from Albert Camus. The quote reads, "The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion."
Wonderful. Thank you so much for listening in. I truly appreciate you. Stay resilient. Thanks so much for tuning in. Head on over to iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on a single episode.